June 28, 1575. The plains of Nagashino. 10,000 mounted samurai advance in perfect formation, the Takeda cavalry, the most feared warriors in all of Japan. For decades, they have been unstoppable. Their reputation alone has won battles. Their crimson armor glints in the morning sun as they lower their lances for the charge. Across the field, Oda Nobunaga waits behind wooden palisades with 3,000 men holding a weapon most samurai consider dishonorable, loud, and beneath the warrior class. In the next hour, those 3,000 guns will shatter the myth of samurai invincibility forever. This is not just the story of a battle. This is the story of how technology killed tradition, how a single day ended centuries of warrior culture, and how the age of the samurai began its long, inevitable death. If you want to discover the untold moments that changed history forever, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling us which historical battle you want to see next. Trust me, this story gets even more incredible. Let's dive in. Japan in 1575 was a land consumed by war. For over a century, the country had been locked in the Sengoku Jidai, the Age of Warring States, a period of endless conflict where regional warlords called daimyo fought for supremacy. The emperor remained in Kyoto, powerless and ceremonial. Real power belonged to whoever could command armies, secure alliances, and conquer territory. It was an age of treachery and brilliance, of legendary warriors and cunning strategists. The ideal of the samurai, the noble warrior bound by Bushido, the code of honor, was both reality and myth. Yes, samurai valued loyalty, martial skill, and honor. But they were also pragmatic, ambitious, and often brutal. The romantic image of the lone swordsman fighting with perfect integrity belonged more to later literature than to the bloody reality of the Sengoku period. These were professional warriors who understood that survival required more than swordsmanship. Among the many daimyo competing for power, two figures dominated the landscape in the 1570s, Takeda Katsuyori and Oda Nobunaga. They represented two fundamentally different visions of warfare, two different approaches to power, and ultimately, two different futures for Japan. The Takeda clan was legendary. Based in Kai province in the mountains of central Japan, they had been forged by Takeda Shingen, one of the greatest generals in Japanese history. Shingen had built an army around heavy cavalry, mounted samurai wielding long lances, trained to charge in devastating formation. The Takeda cavalry had broken countless enemies. They were disciplined, fearless, and supported by an ideology that emphasized warrior virtue and personal courage. When Shingen died in 1573, his son Katsuyori inherited this magnificent war machine. Katsuyori was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. He lacked his father's patience and strategic caution. He wanted to prove himself worthy of the Takeda name, to expand his territory and cement his legacy. His commanders were veterans who had served his father, loyal but also fiercely protective of Takeda military traditions. They believed in the cavalry charge, in samurai courage, in the old ways of war. They had good reason. Those ways had brought victory after victory. Oda Nobunaga was a different kind of leader entirely. Where the Takeda represented tradition, Nobunaga represented revolution. Born into a minor branch of a minor clan, he had clawed his way to power through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and a willingness to abandon tradition when tradition no longer served him. His contemporaries called him innovative. His enemies called him ruthless. Both were correct. Nobunaga understood something that many of his fellow daimyo did not. War was changing. The old model, samurai on horseback, armed with bow and lance, supported by a shigeru foot soldiers with spears, was still effective, but it was not the future. The future belonged to whoever could adapt fastest to new technologies and new tactical systems. Nobunaga had no sentimental attachment to the way things had always been done. If something worked better than tradition, he used it. The technological catalyst for this revolution had arrived in Japan in 1543, when Portuguese traders landed on the island of Tanegashima and brought with them matchlock arquebus, early firearms that the Japanese would call Tanegashima after the island of their introduction. These weapons were crude by later standards, heavy, slow to reload, inaccurate beyond short range, and dangerously unreliable in wet weather. Many samurai dismissed them as peasant weapons, unworthy of a true warrior. But Nobunaga saw their potential. He recognized that a gun, for all its flaws, had one overwhelming advantage. It required relatively little training to use effectively. A peasant could be taught to fire a matchlock in weeks. It took years, sometimes decades, to train a samurai in archery and horsemanship. With firearms, Nobunaga could field larger armies, equip them more quickly, and reduce his dependence on the samurai class that often resisted his authority. By 1575, Nobunaga had accumulated significant power. He controlled Kyoto and held the shogun as his puppet. He had defeated numerous rivals through a combination of conventional warfare, strategic alliance. The road to Nagashino began with a siege. In early 1575, Takeda Katsuyori launched a campaign to expand his territory eastward. His target was Nagashino Castle, a relatively small fortress strategically positioned at the confluence of two rivers in Mikawa province. The castle was held by Okudera Sadamasa, a vassal of Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was himself allied with Oda Nobunaga. Capturing Nagashino would give the Takeda a forward base for further expansion and demonstrate Katsuyori's strength. Katsuyori brought 15,000 troops to besiege the castle. By the standards of Sengoku warfare, this was a substantial force. The castle garrison numbered only 500 men. Under normal circumstances, the siege would be a mere formality: surround the castle, cut off supplies, and wait for inevitable surrender. But Okudera Sadamasa was determined to hold out, hoping that relief would come from his overlord Tokugawa Ieyasu. The siege began in May. Katsuyori's forces surrounded the castle and began the slow work of breaking the defenders' will. They cut off water supplies, launched periodic assaults to test the defenses, and settled in for what they expected would be a short campaign. Inside the castle, the situation grew desperate. Food ran low. Water had to be rationed. The defenders knew that without relief, surrender or death were the only outcomes. Okudera Sadamasa made a desperate decision. He needed to get word to Tokugawa Ieyasu that Nagashino was under siege and would fall without immediate help. A volunteer named Tori Suneman agreed to attempt to break through the Takeda siege lines, swim across the river, and carry the message to Ieyasu. It was nearly a suicide mission, but Tori succeeded. He reached Tokugawa forces, delivered the message, and then made the extraordinary decision to return to the castle to inform the garrison that help was coming. On his return journey, Tori was captured by Takeda forces. Katsuyori, recognizing an opportunity for psychological warfare, brought Tori before the castle walls and offered him his life if he would shout to the defenders that no relief was coming, that they should surrender. Tori agreed. He was brought to the base of the castle walls, and the defenders gathered to hear his message. Then Tori shouted the truth: relief was coming, hold fast, do not surrender. Katsuyori, enraged by the deception, ordered Tori crucified on the spot. The defenders watched their messenger die, but his sacrifice gave them hope. They would hold. And indeed, Tokugawa Ieyasu was already marching to their relief with 8,000 men. But Ieyasu knew that 8,000 troops were not enough to face Katsuyori's 15,000, especially when a significant portion of the Takeda force consisted of their legendary cavalry. So Ieyasu sent an urgent request to his overlord and ally, Oda Nobunaga: "Come to Nagashino with your army, or the castle will fall, and Takeda power will grow unchecked. Nobunaga responded with characteristic decisiveness. He mobilized 30,000 troops, one of the largest armies he had ever assembled, and began the march toward Nagashino. Among his forces were 3,000 soldiers equipped with matchlock arquebus, the Tanegashima firearms that Nobunaga had been accumulating and training men to use for years. This concentration of firearms was unprecedented in Japanese warfare. No one had ever deployed guns on such a scale. When news reached Katsuyori that Nobunaga and Ieyasu were approaching with a combined force of 38,000 men, he faced a critical decision. The strategically sound choice would be to abandon the siege and retreat to more defensible positions in Takeda territory. His advisors urged this course. The enemy outnumbered him more than 2-1. Fighting would be madness. But Katsuyori was not his father. He lacked Shingen's patience and his willingness to retreat when circumstances demanded it. Katsuyori saw the approaching battle as an opportunity to prove himself, to win a glorious victory that would cement his reputation and justify his aggressive policies. He convinced himself, and was encouraged by more aggressive commanders, that the quality of Takeda troops, especially their cavalry, would overcome numerical disadvantage. The Takeda had won against the odds before. They would do so again. Katsuyori made his decision. He would lift the siege of Nagashino Castle and march to meet Nobunaga's army in open battle. It was a decision that would doom thousands of his men and begin the end of an era. Oda Nobunaga arrived at Nagashino with a plan that was radical by contemporary Japanese standards. He had no intention of fighting a traditional battle. Instead, he chose ground carefully and prepared a defense designed specifically to neutralize the Takeda cavalry's greatest strength, their devastating charge. The battlefield Nobunaga selected was on the Shitaragahara Plain, a relatively open area bordered by the Rengagawa River. But Nobunaga did not intend to meet the Takeda in the open. In the days before battle, his troops constructed extensive fortifications, wooden palisades forming a zigzag pattern stretching nearly a mile across the front. These palisades were roughly chest-high, strong enough to stop charging horses but with gaps that allowed defenders to fire through. Behind these palisades, Nobunaga positioned his 3,000 arquebusiers in 3 ranks. This arrangement was crucial to his tactical plan. Matchlock guns of the period were slow to reload. The process could take 30 seconds or more, requiring the soldier to measure powder, load the ball, ram it down, prime the pan, and apply the burning match to the touch hole. For that half-minute, the gunner was defenseless. But if arquebusiers were arranged in 3 ranks, each rank could fire in rotation while the others reloaded. This created a nearly continuous rate of fire, something no archer could match. The palisades served multiple purposes. First, they physically prevented cavalry from reaching the gunners. A horse will not willingly charge into a solid barrier, and even if forced forward, the palisade would break the momentum and cohesion of any cavalry charge. Second, Nobunaga's samurai cavalry and infantry were positioned on the flanks and in reserve. Their role would be to exploit any breakthroughs and to counterattack once the Takeda forces had been weakened by gunfire. Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces held supporting positions, ready to reinforce any threatened section of the line. The entire defensive system was designed around a simple principle: force the Takeda to attack fortified positions while under continuous fire from weapons they could not effectively counter at range. It was a rejection of samurai martial ideals. There would be no single combat between champions. No opportunity for individual warriors to demonstrate their courage and skill. Just systematic, industrial killing. Many of Nobunaga's own samurai were uncomfortable with these tactics. To fight from behind walls, to use guns instead of swords and bows, to refuse honorable combat, these seemed like the acts of cowards. But Nobunaga was not interested in honor for honor's sake. He was interested in winning. And winning meant using every advantage, no matter how untraditional. On the evening of June 27th, as Nobunaga's forces completed their preparations, Takeda Katsuyori held a council of war with his commanders. What was discussed there would be debated by historians for centuries. Some accounts suggest that many Takeda commanders urged caution, even retreat. They could see Nobunaga's fortifications and understood that a frontal assault would be costly. Better to withdraw, force Nobunaga to attack them on more favorable ground, or wait for circumstances to change. But other commanders, particularly younger ones eager to prove themselves, argued for attack. The Takeda cavalry had never been stopped. Their reputation alone might break the enemy's will. And how could samurai, true samurai, refuse battle and retreat before an enemy who hid behind walls and fought with peasant weapons? To refuse combat would be to admit fear. It would damage the Takeda reputation irreparably. Katsuyori sided with the aggressive faction. Whether this was due to his own pride, pressure from hot-headed subordinates, or genuine belief that his cavalry could overcome any defense, we cannot know with certainty. But the decision was made. At dawn on June 28th, the Takeda cavalry would charge. They would break through Nobunaga's lines, scatter his forces, and prove once again that samurai courage could overcome any obstacle. It was a decision based on tradition, pride, and past success. It would collide with a new reality where tradition and pride were no match for technology and tactical innovation. The stage was set for one of the most one-sided battles in Japanese history. Dawn broke on June 28, 1575, with light rain, not heavy enough to stop the battle, but enough to worry Nobunaga's gunners. Matchlock arquebus were notoriously unreliable in wet conditions. If the powder got damp or the match went out, the weapons became useless clubs. Nobunaga's staff had anticipated this problem. They had prepared wooden covers and oiled cloths to protect the powder and keep the matches dry. It was another example of the careful preparation that characterized Nobunaga's approach to warfare. As morning mist lifted from the Shitaragahara plain, the two armies faced each other across perhaps 400 yards of open ground. The sight must have been spectacular and terrible. On one side, the Takeda force, thousands of mounted samurai in red and gold armor, their banners displaying the 4 diamonds of the Takeda Mon, their lances and swords catching the early light. They represented centuries of warrior tradition, an unbroken lineage of martial culture stretching back to the founding of the samurai class. On the other side, Nobunaga's forces behind their wooden palisades looked less impressive. Many of the arquebusiers were not samurai at all but a shigaru, common soldiers recruited from the peasant class. They wore simpler armor, often just chest plates and helmets. But they held weapons that could kill a mounted samurai at 100 yards, regardless of armor or skill or centuries of tradition. The Takeda commanders organized their forces for the assault. The cavalry would charge in waves, multiple groups attacking different sections of Nobunaga's line simultaneously to divide defensive fire and create breakthroughs. Once through the palisades, they would roll up the enemy line from the flanks. It was sound tactical doctrine for cavalry warfare. It had worked many times before. What the Takeda commanders did not fully appreciate, could not fully appreciate, having never faced massed gunfire before, was how devastating continuous volley fire would be against charging cavalry. They knew that arquebus were loud and that they could kill. But they imagined guns as simply another ranged weapon, comparable to bows. They were wrong. Around 8 in the morning, Takeda Katsuyori gave the order to attack. The first wave of cavalry, roughly 2,000 mounted samurai, began their charge. They came forward at a trot initially, building speed as they crossed the plain. The riders shouted war cries. Battle standards waved. For those watching from Nobunaga's lines, the sight of that mass of armored horsemen thundering forward must have been terrifying. Many of the Ashigaru gunners had never been in battle before. They were facing the most feared cavalry in Japan. But Nobunaga's commanders held the gunners steady. "Wait. Hold your fire. Wait for the order." The cavalry came closer. 300 yards. 200 yards. Still no order to fire. The discipline required to stand behind a wooden palisade while thousands of cavalry charged directly at you cannot be overstated. 150 yards. 100 yards. Then, finally, the order, "Fire!" The first rank of arquebusiers discharged their weapons simultaneously. Hundreds of guns going off together created a sound unlike anything most people on that battlefield had ever heard, a thunderous, rolling boom that echoed across the plain and through the surrounding hills. The smoke from the black powder created an instant fog bank in front of Nobunaga's lines. Through that smoke, the cavalry came on. But they were not untouched. Horses went down, shot through the chest or head. Riders fell from their saddles, armor pierced by lead balls. The charge wavered but did not break. Then the second rank fired. Another rolling thunder. Another wave of smoke and lead. More horses down. More riders dead or screaming from wounds. The charge was slowing. Horses that moments before had been galloping at full speed were now stumbling over bodies, spooked by the noise and smoke, refusing to press forward against the palisades. The third rank fired. And by now, the first rank had reloaded. The killing was continuous, systematic, terrible. And the Takeda cavalry, for all their courage and skill, could do nothing to stop it. The first Takeda charge broke before reaching the palisades. It did not break because of cowardice. The riders were among the bravest warriors in Japan. It broke because horses, no matter how well trained, will not willingly charge into a solid barrier while under fire, when other horses around them are falling and dying. The surviving cavalry wheeled and retreated, leaving dozens of dead and wounded behind. From behind the palisades, Nobunaga's forces watched the retreat with grim satisfaction. The arquebusiers began reloading. Commanders walked behind the lines, checking ammunition supplies, tightening discipline, preparing for the next assault. They knew the Takeda would attack again. Samurai culture did not permit retreat after a single repulse. Pride demanded another attempt. In the Takeda command area, there was confusion and anger. How could the charge have failed? Some commanders blamed the terrain, others the initial positioning. A few, very few, suggested that perhaps frontal assault against fortified guns was simply impossible. But this view was dismissed as defeatist. The Takeda had faced adversity before and overcome it through courage and persistence. They would do so again. Katsuyori ordered a second assault, this time with even more cavalry committed. If the first charge had been repulsed because it was too small, a larger force would surely break through. Around mid-morning, perhaps 3,000 mounted samurai formed up for another charge. The ground they had to cross was now littered with bodies and wounded horses, making the approach even more difficult. The second charge began. Again, the disciplined advance. Again, the building speed. Again, the war cries and the thunder of hooves. And again, Nobunaga's gunners waited until the cavalry was at close range before opening fire. The first volley tore through the front ranks. The second volley struck those behind. The third volley broke the charge completely. This time, some cavalry actually reached the palisades. A few riders even managed to leap their horses over the barriers or force through gaps. But once through, they found themselves isolated, surrounded by Ashigaru with spears and samurai with swords. Individual cavalry, separated from their formations, were quickly overwhelmed. Those who made it through the palisades died there. The second charge retreated, leaving even more dead than the first. The ground between the armies was now carpeted with bodies, men and horses twisted together, some dead, some dying, some trying to crawl back toward their own lines. The noise was horrific: screaming horses, wounded men calling for help, the incessant boom of arquebus, commanders shouting orders, the clash of metal on metal where close combat occurred at the palisades. Incredibly, Katsuyori ordered a third charge. By now, it should have been clear that frontal assault was suicide. But the logic of samurai culture trapped the Takeda commanders. To refuse battle, to admit that the enemy's tactics had made their cavalry ineffective, was psychologically impossible. It would mean acknowledging that everything they had believed about warfare, everything their fathers and grandfathers had taught them, was wrong. Better to die courageously than to live with that admission. The third charge was smaller. Many of the Takeda cavalry units had been decimated, and horses were now in short supply. Perhaps 1,500 riders formed up. Some accounts suggest that many went forward knowing they would die, viewing the charge as a form of honorable suicide rather than a tactical maneuver. The concept of Gyokusai, sacrificial suicide attack, would become more famous in later Japanese history, but its roots were visible at Nagashino. The third charge failed like the others. The gunfire was relentless. Volley after volley crashed into the advancing cavalry. Bodies piled upon bodies. The few who reached the palisades were killed by spears and swords. The charge broke. The survivors retreated. By early afternoon, the Takeda cavalry, the pride of the clan, the weapon that had won countless victories, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Thousands lay dead or wounded on the plain. The survivors were demoralized, their horses exhausted or dead, their commanders killed or wounded. They had charged with courage and discipline into gunfire that courage and discipline could not overcome. And now, with the Takeda cavalry shattered, Oda Nobunaga prepared to transition from defense to attack. The killing was not over. In fact, for the Takeda, the worst was yet to come. With the Takeda cavalry destroyed, Nobunaga gave the order his samurai had been waiting for all day: advance and attack. The palisades had served their purpose. Now it was time to finish the enemy. Nobunaga's cavalry, fresh and unblooded, swept around the flanks. His infantry advanced from behind the fortifications, spears and swords ready. The Ishigaru gunners, their primary work done, joined the advance or provided covering fire as Takeda positions came into range. The Takeda army was now in a desperate situation. Their cavalry was gone. Their best warriors were dead or wounded. The infantry and support troops that remained were demoralized by watching the cavalry charges fail so catastrophically. They had never seen anything like this. In traditional samurai warfare, battles were often decided relatively quickly, and casualties, while significant, were manageable. This was some Takeda units attempted to form defensive positions. Spearmen created hedgehog formations, hoping to hold off Nobunaga's advancing forces long enough to organize a retreat. Archers provided covering fire. But they were fighting an enemy that now had every advantage. Nobunaga's forces outnumbered them more than 2 to 1. The Takeda were surrounded on 3 sides, with the river at their back limiting escape routes. And the psychological impact of the morning's disaster had broken their fighting spirit. Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces, which had held defensive positions during the cavalry charges, now joined the attack. They pushed forward from the direction of Nagashino Castle, cutting off potential Takeda retreat routes. The Takeda army was being compressed into an ever smaller area. Men who tried to flee toward the river found the banks too steep or the current too strong. Many drowned trying to escape. Others were cut down from behind. Takeda Katsuyori, watching his army disintegrate, faced the moment every commander dreads, the realization that the battle is lost and the only question is how many men can be saved. Some of his guards urged him to flee while there was still time. If he died here, the Takeda clan would be left leaderless, vulnerable to enemies beyond just Nobunaga. His duty was to survive and rebuild. Katsuyori, with a small bodyguard of loyal retainers, fought his way toward the rear of the battlefield. It was a desperate running battle. Many of his guards died buying time for their lord to escape. Accounts suggest that Katsuyori wept as he fled, whether from shame, grief for his dead men, or rage at his defeat, we cannot know. But he survived. He would live to fight other battles, though he would never recover from Nagashino. Not all Takeda commanders were so fortunate. Many chose to die rather than flee. In samurai culture, there was honor in death in battle, and shame in surviving a catastrophic defeat. Some commanders, surrounded and seeing no escape, performed seppuku, ritual suicide, rather than face capture or the indignity of fleeing. Others fought to the death, taking as many enemies with them as they could. The casualty list of Takeda nobles and experienced commanders was devastating, not just in numbers but in the loss of institutional military knowledge and leadership. By late afternoon, organized Takeda resistance had collapsed. What remained was pursuit and killing. Nobunaga's forces hunted down fleeing Takeda soldiers throughout the evening and into the next day. Some Takeda troops managed to escape into the mountains, traveling at night and hiding during the day, eventually making their way back to Takeda territory. But many were caught and killed. The exact casualty figures are debated by historians, but most estimates suggest that the Takeda lost between 10 and 12,000 men killed or captured out of their original 15,000. It was annihilation. Nobunaga's losses were comparatively light, perhaps 700 to 1,000 killed and wounded, most of them occurring during the final assault rather than during the defensive phase. The disparity was stunning. It was perhaps the most one-sided major battle of the Sengoku period, and it was achieved primarily through the tactical use of firearms in a way that had never been done before in Japan. The Battle of Nagashino was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold. The age of the samurai would never be quite the same. In the immediate aftermath of Nagashino, Oda Nobunaga made a calculated decision that would be remembered as one of the most brutal acts of the Sengoku period. He ordered the execution of captured Takeda samurai. This violated the normal customs of Japanese warfare, where high-ranking prisoners were often ransomed and common soldiers sometimes spared or recruited. But Nobunaga was making a statement. There would be no mercy for those who opposed him. The era of gentlemanly warfare among samurai was over. Hundreds of Takeda prisoners were beheaded. Their heads were displayed as trophies and warnings. The message to other daimyo was clear. Nobunaga would destroy anyone who stood against him, and he would do so using whatever methods proved most effective, regardless of tradition or honor. This ruthlessness terrified his enemies but also bred resentment that would eventually contribute to his assassination 7 years later. For Takeda Katsuyori, the disaster at Nagashino marked the beginning of the end. He had lost not just a battle but the core of his military power. The Takeda cavalry, built over decades by his father, was gone. The experienced commanders who might have helped him rebuild were dead. The aura of Takeda invincibility was shattered. Neighboring daimyo who had remained neutral or maintained alliances now sensed weakness. Within 7 years, the Takeda clan would be destroyed completely, and Katsuyori would commit seppuku as enemy forces closed in on his last stronghold. But the consequences of Nagashino extended far beyond the fate of the Takeda. The battle demonstrated conclusively that firearms, when used properly and in sufficient numbers, could overcome traditional samurai warfare. Other daimyo took note. Matchlock arquebus, which had been curiosities or supplementary weapons, now became essential components of any serious military force. The demand for guns skyrocketed. Japanese smiths, learning from Portuguese designs, began producing Tanegashima in large quantities. Within a generation, Japan had more firearms than any European nation, a fact that still surprises many people who assume technological advancement flowed only from west to east. But with the rise of firearms came a transformation in the nature of warfare and, ultimately, in the role of the samurai. When victory depended on cavalry charges and archery skills that took years to develop, the samurai were indispensable. They were the only ones with the training, equipment, and time to become effective warriors. This gave them political power and social prestige. They were not just soldiers but a ruling class justified by their martial skills. Firearms changed the calculation. A peasant could be trained to use an arquebus in weeks. He would never have the years of training in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and archery that defined a samurai. But his gun could kill a samurai just as effectively as the samurai's sword could kill him, perhaps more effectively, since the gun had greater range. The mystique of the samurai as uniquely dangerous warriors was punctured by the reality that any commoner with a gun was a threat. This did not mean samurai disappeared. Far from it. Samurai remained the officer class, the administrators, and the social elite. But their military monopoly was broken. Warfare became less about individual martial excellence and more about organizing large forces, maintaining supply lines, and deploying combined arms tactics. The romantic image of the samurai, the lone warrior whose skill and honor could change the course of battle, became increasingly divorced from battlefield reality. Oda Nobunaga himself would not live to see the full transformation he had initiated. In 1582, betrayed by one of his own generals, he was forced to commit seppuku when his position became untenable. But his legacy was carried forward by his successors, first Toyotomi Hideyoshi, then Tokugawa Ieyasu. These men would complete the unification of Japan that Nobunaga had begun, and they would do so using the lessons of Nagashino. Firearms were not just supplementary weapons but central to military power. Victory went not to the most honorable but to the most effective. By the time Tokugawa Ieyasu established the Tokugawa shogunate in 1603, ending the Sengoku period, the nature of the samurai had already transformed. They remained a privileged class, but they were increasingly bureaucrats and administrators rather than warriors. The age of constant warfare that had defined the samurai experience for over a century was ending. And with it, much of what had made the samurai culture distinct. The transformation of Japanese warfare after Nagashino was not immediate or simple. For decades, firearms coexisted with traditional weapons and tactics. Bows remained important, particularly for hunting and for mounted combat where the arquebus' slow reload time was a disadvantage. Swords retained their symbolic importance and their utility in close combat. Cavalry did not disappear but adapted, learning to avoid frontal charges against prepared positions with massed gunfire. But the trajectory was clear. Warfare was becoming more systematic, more dependent on logistics and organization than on individual heroism. The battles of the late Sengoku period increasingly resembled sieges or carefully prepared defensive positions rather than the mobile cavalry actions that had characterized earlier decades. Fortifications became more sophisticated, designed specifically to provide cover for gunners and to channel attackers into killing zones. Interestingly, this trend would reverse dramatically after the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate. Once Japan was unified and peace established, the Tokugawa government began to strictly regulate firearms. Gun ownership was increasingly restricted to authorized military forces. Production of new firearms was controlled. Over time, the number of functioning guns in Japan actually decreased. This was partly practical. With no more wars to fight, there was less need for weapons, but also ideological. The Tokugawa shoguns wanted to preserve samurai status and prevent commoner uprisings. Firearms in the hands of peasants were dangerous to that social order. By the 1600s, Japan had entered the Edo period, 2.5 centuries of relative peace under Tokugawa rule. During this time, the samurai transformed almost completely. They were no longer warriors in practice, but in name and tradition. Most samurai never saw combat. They served as administrators, tax collectors, and policemen. They were required to carry swords as symbols of their status, but the swords were more often decorative than functional. Martial arts were practiced as cultural traditions and spiritual disciplines rather than practical combat training. This era produced the idealized image of the samurai that persists in popular culture, the concept of Bushido as a complete ethical system, the emphasis on loyalty and self-sacrifice, the aesthetic of the warrior poet who values beauty and honor as much as martial skill. Much of this was mythology, created during the Edo period to give meaning to a warrior class that no longer fought wars. But the mythology was powerful, shaping Japanese culture and identity for centuries. The samurai class was finally abolished in the 1870s during the Meiji Restoration, when Japan opened to the West and rapidly modernized. Former samurai were forbidden to carry swords in public. The privileges and stipends that had supported them were eliminated. Many samurai became business leaders, military officers in the new Western-style army, or government officials. Others struggled to adapt to a world where their traditional skills and status meant nothing. Some resisted. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 was led by former samurai who rejected modernization and wanted to preserve traditional warrior culture. They fought with swords and traditional tactics against a conscript army equipped with modern rifles and artillery. The rebellion was crushed. It was, in a sense, the final battle of the samurai, and it demonstrated once again that traditional warrior culture could not stand against modern military technology. The irony is that the process which ended at the Meiji Restoration had begun at Nagashino. The battle in 1575 was the first clear demonstration that samurai military supremacy was technologically obsolete. Everything that followed, the unification of Japan, the Tokugawa peace, the eventual abolition of the samurai class, flowed from that realization. The 3,000 guns that Oda Nobunaga deployed on that June morning began a chain of consequences that would transform Japan completely. To understand the full significance of Nagashino, we must examine not just what happened, but why it happened. The battle was not simply a matter of superior technology defeating inferior technology. It was about a specific tactical system designed to maximize the advantages of firearms while minimizing their disadvantages, deployed against an enemy whose tactical doctrine and cultural values made them vulnerable to exactly that system. Matchlock arquebus in 1575 were far from perfect weapons. They were heavy, typically weighing 10 to 15 pounds. They were slow to reload, 30 seconds or more even for an experienced user. They were inaccurate beyond about 100 yards. They were vulnerable to weather. Rain could make them completely useless. The sound and smoke terrified horses, but they also made it difficult for the gunners themselves to see what they were shooting at after the first volley. And they were expensive, a good arquebus cost as much as a samurai's annual stipend. But firearms had advantages that, in the right circumstances, outweighed these limitations. First, they required relatively little training. A peasant conscript could be taught to load and fire an arquebus in weeks, whereas training a samurai in archery and horsemanship took years. This meant armies could be expanded quickly without waiting for warriors to mature. Second, guns had psychological impact. The noise and smoke were terrifying to those not accustomed to them, and the wounds guns inflicted were often more horrible than those from arrows or swords. Third, and most importantly, guns could punch through armor that would stop arrows. A lead ball from an arquebus could penetrate samurai armor at ranges where arrows bounced off. Oda Nobunaga understood these advantages and built a tactical system to exploit them. The palisades protected gunners during their vulnerable reload time and channeled enemy attacks into predictable zones. The three-rank system created continuous fire, eliminating the gaps that occurred when all gunners fired and reloaded simultaneously. The defensive position forced the enemy to attack, giving Nobunaga's forces the advantage of choosing ground and preparing it. And the massive concentration of firearms, 3,000 in one place, created firepower density that had never been seen before in Japanese warfare. The Takeda, by contrast, were trapped by their own success and their own culture. Their cavalry tactics had worked brilliantly for decades. They had defeated numerous enemies using the same formations and the same aggressive approach. This created confidence, justified confidence, in their methods. Why change what works? Moreover, samurai culture emphasized personal courage and aggressive action. To refuse battle, to admit that an enemy's tactics made your preferred method of fighting impossible, was psychologically difficult. It seemed like cowardice. This cultural trap affected decision-making at every level. Takeda commanders who might have recognized that frontal assault against fortified guns was suicidal could not say so publicly without appearing cowardly. Katsuyori, who wanted to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy, could not back down without losing face. Individual samurai, who might have preferred to live, charged anyway because refusing to charge would have been shameful. The very values that made samurai effective warriors, courage, loyalty, commitment to honor, became liabilities when those values prevented rational assessment of tactical reality. This pattern has repeated throughout military history. Successful armies develop doctrines that work, then become psychologically and institutionally committed to those doctrines. When technological or tactical changes make the old doctrines obsolete, armies struggle to adapt because adaptation requires admitting that everything officers have been taught and everything that brought them success and promotion was wrong. The institution resists. Individual officers who suggest radical changes are dismissed as heretics or cowards. The French cavalry in World War I charged German machine guns with the same feudal courage the Takeda showed at Nagashino. British and French commanders in World War II initially struggled to adapt to German combined arms tactics because those tactics violated their understanding of proper warfare. American forces in Vietnam found that their firepower advantages meant little against an enemy who refused to fight the kind of battles Americans were trained for. The lesson of Nagashino, that past success does not guarantee future victory, that tactics must constantly adapt to new realities, is one that military organizations repeatedly fail to learn. But Nagashino also teaches a lesson about technological change and social structure. The samurai were not just warriors. They were a ruling class whose political and economic privileges were justified by their military function. When firearms made their specialized martial skills less valuable, the entire social system that elevated them was called into question. They could not simply adapt to new weapons because doing so would undermine the ideology that justified their superior status. The human dimension of Nagashino deserves attention beyond the strategic and tactical analysis. Thousands of individual men experienced that day, their moment of courage or terror or confusion or death. Each had his own story, his own reasons for being there, his own experience of the horror. For the Takeda cavalry who made those charges, the experience must have been nightmarish. They were trained from childhood to believe in their superiority as warriors. They had inherited traditions of combat stretching back centuries. They wore armor that had been passed down through generations, carrying swords that were family treasures. They rode into battle alongside men they had known all their lives, brothers, cousins, childhood friends, fellow members of warrior households that had served the Takeda for generations. And then they charged into gunfire unlike anything they had experienced before. The noise alone, hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, would have been disorienting. The smoke made it impossible to see what was happening. Horses around them fell, throwing riders or trampling them. Men they had known since childhood suddenly had holes blown through their armor, blood spreading across expensive lacquered plates. And they could do nothing to fight back. Their skill with sword and lance meant nothing when they could not reach the enemy. Some accounts suggest that by the third charge, many Takeda samurai understood they were going to die but charged anyway because refusing would be worse than death. This was not stupid or irrational by their cultural standards. For a samurai, reputation and honor were everything. To die courageously in battle was tragic but honorable. To refuse and survive would mean permanent shame, not just for the individual but for his family. Better a glorious death than a shameful life. For Nobunaga's Ashigaru gunners, the experience was different but also intense. Many were peasants who had been conscripted or hired as soldiers only recently. They had minimal military training. They were facing the legendary Takeda cavalry, warriors who appeared in songs and stories as nearly superhuman. When that mass of armored horsemen began charging directly at them, the terror must have been overwhelming. But the discipline held. Officers walked behind the ranks, keeping men steady, ensuring the three-rank firing system worked properly. The palisades provided psychological comfort as well as physical protection. There was a barrier between them and the enemy. And once the shooting started, training took over. Load, aim, fire, step back. Let the next rank shoot. Reload. Step forward. Fire again. The mechanical nature of the drill helped men function despite their fear. After the battle, as the gunners advanced with the rest of Nobunaga's forces to pursue fleeing Takeda troops, some of them would have participated in the killing of wounded enemies and the execution of prisoners. For peasant soldiers, killing samurai, members of the class that normally commanded absolute deference, must have been strange and perhaps empowering. The social order was being inverted. Commoners with guns could kill nobles. This realization had implications far beyond the battlefield. For commanders on both sides, Nagashino was a defining moment. Takeda officers who survived had to live with the knowledge that their tactical doctrine had led thousands of men to pointless deaths. Some committed suicide afterward from shame. Others survived and tried to rebuild, but they were haunted by Nagashino for the rest of their lives. The battle appeared in their nightmares and their poems. Nobunaga's officers, by contrast, had participated in a revolutionary victory. They had proven that new methods could defeat traditional ones, that innovation could overcome superior numbers and legendary reputations. Some took pride in this. Others were uncomfortable with the methods, the use of peasant soldiers with guns, the execution of prisoners, the rejection of martial honor in favor of cold effectiveness. But all recognized they had witnessed a turning point. The battlefield itself, after the fighting ended, was a scene of horror. Thousands of bodies, human and horse, lay scattered across the plain. The wounded cried out for water or for someone to finish them. Scavengers moved through the carnage, stripping armor and weapons from the dead. The smell of blood and gunpowder and death hung over the area for days. Local villagers were pressed into service burying the dead. Mass graves were dug. Buddhist monks performed ceremonies for the fallen. The battlefield became a haunted place in local memory, a site where spirits of the angry dead were said to linger. The legacy of Nagashino shaped not just Japanese military development but Japanese culture and national identity in ways that extended for centuries. The battle became a symbol, interpreted differently by different generations according to their own concerns and ideologies. During the Edo period, when the samurai were a privileged but largely non-military class, Nagashino was often presented as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and rashness. Stories emphasized Takeda Katsuyori's failure to listen to wise counsel, his impetuousness, his inability to match his father's strategic patience. The lesson was aimed at contemporary samurai: be humble, listen to advice, value wisdom over martial valor. This interpretation conveniently ignored the broader question of whether samurai military culture itself had been made obsolete. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Japan rapidly modernized and built a Western-style military, Nagashino was reinterpreted as a story about innovation and adaptation. Oda Nobunaga became a proto-modernizer, a visionary who understood that Japan must embrace new technologies and methods to survive. The Takeda became symbols of conservative resistance to necessary, an ideology that would lead to catastrophic decisions like kamikaze attacks and last-stand defenses of indefensible positions. After World War II, Japanese historians generally returned to more nuanced interpretations. Nagashino was studied as a case study in military innovation, tactical adaptation, and the relationship between technology and social change. The battle appeared in textbooks, documentaries, and popular culture. It became a standard reference point in discussions of Japanese military history. In the West, Nagashino is less well known than it should be. Most Western military historians focus on European warfare, treating Asian conflicts as peripheral curiosities. But Nagashino deserves recognition as one of the most important battles in world military history. It was one of the first large-scale demonstrations of how firearms could be used to completely dominate traditional cavalry. The tactical principles Nobunaga applied, defense in depth, massed fire, rotating volleys, would be rediscovered and refined by European military theorists over the following centuries. The battle also illuminates broader themes about technological change and social resistance. The samurai were not simply warriors who could be retrained with new weapons. They were an entire social class whose identity, privileges, and worldview were tied to a particular mode of warfare. When that mode became obsolete, they faced a choice: adapt and lose their special status, or maintain their traditions and become irrelevant. Many chose a middle path, maintaining the forms and rituals of samurai culture while gradually accepting that real military power now resided elsewhere. But this compromise was always uncomfortable and ultimately unsustainable. Modern military professionals study Nagashino for practical lessons. The U.S. Army includes the battle in its officer training curricula as an example of how technological advantage must be leveraged through appropriate tactics. Simply having superior weapons is not enough. You must use them in ways that maximize their strengths and minimize their weaknesses while exploiting enemy vulnerabilities. Nobunaga understood this. He built a complete tactical system around his firearms rather than just adding guns to existing formations. The battle also demonstrates the danger of fighting the last war. The Takeda were supremely confident because their cavalry had won so many previous battles. But those victories had occurred against enemies who did not have massed firearms deployed behind fortifications. The Takeda applied lessons from past successes to a situation where those lessons were no longer valid. This is a trap every military organization must guard against: Success breeds confidence and commitment to proven methods, but those proven methods may not work against new challenges. For Japan, Nagashino marked the beginning of a long transformation. The process initiated on that battlefield in 1575 would take 3 centuries to complete, but the endpoint was clear from the start. The age of the samurai as a warrior class was ending. What would replace it was not yet certain, but the old order was dying, killed by 3,000 guns on a June morning. As we look back across more than 4 centuries at the Battle of Nagashino, what final lessons emerge from that day of fire and death on the Shitaragahara plain? What does this story of samurai courage meeting technological change tell us about warfare, culture, and the often tragic process of historical transformation? First, there is the lesson about innovation and adaptation. Oda Nobunaga won at Nagashino not because he had superior numbers or braver soldiers, but because he understood how to use a new technology in ways his enemies did not. The matchlock arquebus was not a secret weapon. The Takeda had guns too. But Nobunaga recognized that firearms were not just another ranged weapon to be integrated into existing tactics. They required a complete rethinking of how battles were fought. He built fortifications to protect his gunners. He organized them in ranks for continuous fire. He chose defensive ground and forced the enemy to attack. The guns were the tool, but the innovation was the tactical system built around them. This principle applies far beyond 16th century Japan. Throughout history, technological advantages have been squandered by commanders who tried to use new weapons with old tactics. The early tanks in World War I were often wasted in frontal assaults when they should have been used for breakthrough and exploitation. Early aircraft were initially viewed as reconnaissance tools before visionaries recognized their potential for strategic bombing and air superiority. Nuclear weapons were initially conceptualized as simply bigger bombs before strategists understood they required entirely new doctrines of deterrence. Having the technology is not enough. You must understand how to use it. Second, there is the lesson about culture and military effectiveness. The Takeda were not stupid. They were experienced, skilled, and brave. But their cultural values made it psychologically difficult to adopt tactics that violated those values. Charging fortifications was suicidal, but refusing to. Third, there is the recognition that technology can disrupt not just military tactics but entire social orders. The samurai were not simply soldiers who could be retrained. They were a ruling class whose political power, economic privileges, and cultural identity were all bound up with their military function. When firearms made their specialized skills less valuable, it called into question the entire social system. This is why the transformation of Japanese society took centuries. It was not just about adopting new weapons, but about renegotiating the entire structure of power and status. We see similar dynamics today with automation and artificial intelligence. These are not just new tools, but technologies that threaten to make entire categories of human skills obsolete. The resistance to automation is not simply about jobs, but about identity. If your sense of self is built around being skilled at something, and a machine can now do it better, what are you? The samurai at Nagashino faced a version of this existential question. So did artisans during the Industrial Revolution. So do knowledge workers today facing AI. The pattern repeats because it reflects something fundamental about how humans relate to technology and social change. Finally, there is the human dimension. Those Takeda samurai who charged 3 times into certain death were not foolish. By their own cultural logic, they were doing exactly what honor and duty required. They could not see the future, could not know that their entire way of life was becoming obsolete. They fought with courage for values they believed in, and they died, and the world moved on without them. There is tragedy in that, but also inevitability. The age of the samurai ended not because samurai were bad people or inferior warriors, but because history had moved beyond the conditions that made samurai culture functional. No amount of courage or skill could preserve a social system whose military foundation had been eroded by technological change. On June 28, 1575, 3,000 guns fired on the Shitaragahara plain. In the smoke and noise and death of that morning, an era ended. The samurai would persist for centuries more as a social class, but their military supremacy died at Nagashino. The secret weapon was not really the guns themselves. It was the understanding that war had changed, that the old ways were obsolete, and that survival required abandoning tradition in favor of effectiveness. The lesson echoes across the centuries: adapt or die. And sometimes, even when you know adaptation is necessary, your culture won't let you. That is the tragedy of Nagashino, and the tragedy of every society that has faced obsolescence and found it easier to die with honor than to live by changing.